All right, now we will take a moment to introduce you to our speaker. Our speaker today is Paul Kennedy. Paul is a senior manager on Rehmann's Technology Solutions team. Paul provides clients with peace of mind by serving as a chief information security officer, as well as leading other cybersecurity consulting and assessment engagements for organizations in a variety of industries, including the public sector. And again, I'm Erin Trask. I'm a senior manager on Rehmann's Public Sector Finance and Accounting Solutions team. In my role, I provide Chief Financial Officer services, consultation, report preparation, and department oversight to public sector clients. Paul, you may begin your presentation.
Thanks, Erin. A couple of things off the bat before we dive in. I appreciate the introduction, Erin. And Erin and I have had the chance to work together a number of times, and it's great to be able to share this stage here with you. I'm sure we'll have some thoughts to share together on some of our shared experiences as we go through. I'll apologize up front that I have a cough today, so hopefully I'll try to mute if I do have to cough, but I appreciate your patience in advance. And the other thing that I'll throw out there is that there's a lot of content in these slides, and it's not intended for us to go through all of it here today. We posted the presentation, or we will post the presentation, and we'll have the recording available for your use. So, definitely appreciate any questions the audience has, and know that these materials are built for your use outside of this webinar as well. In our agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity trends and just some basics of cybersecurity to make sure that everyone's going into this conversation with the same context. And then we're really going to dive into the meat of the content today with the 5 steps that we think organizations should be going through in order to implement and then maintain their program on an ongoing basis. Cybersecurity is a process. It needs to be a process and a collaborative process across the organization, as we'll talk about. And so it's important to think about this as getting the right processes in place. These are the initial 5 steps, and there'll be things to keep maintaining in the future as well. And with that, we'll dive in. As I'm sure everyone sees, it feels like you turn on the news or you open Google News or wherever your news sources are these days, and they're full of headlines about cybersecurity incidents, especially in the public sector. The public sector, based on the industry you're in, does a lot more reporting than a lot of other types of organizations that I work with, which makes it very visible when something happens. But at the same time, there's also a lot of impact when something goes wrong as well. So I pulled just a couple examples here from within the last 6 to 12 months of headlines that you could go find in when you open up your daily report. And the takeaway out of those is to understand that cybersecurity has a very real impact on each of your organizations. When something goes wrong, and it can go wrong very drastically, but also it's not necessarily going to go wrong all that often. And so it's almost in this category of black swan type events where it can go very poorly, and you need to maintain your vigilance and do these procedures on an ongoing basis. Otherwise, you won't be prepared when something does go wrong. I pulled in an example, and this is now about a year old, and I pick on someone out on the East Coast with Suffolk County in New York. That's pretty much all of Long Island. They had a very large county, I think well over 1 million constituents in the county, 1.5 million constituents in the county at the time of the attack. They got hit with ransomware. There's all sorts of backstory of how it got in, but there's lots of data out there about what happened at Suffolk County, which is why I use them. They went offline and detected this attack on September 8th of 2022. And they found, though, that the attacker got into their environment actually more than a year prior to that, in September, October of 2021, I believe it was. When the ransomware was deployed in their environment, it took down all sorts of services, whether it was the sheriff's department ability to actually use their ticketing systems or other services they need to actually operate emergency services. And they had to fall back to their continuity of operations plan with delegating that to either the state or other counties or other municipalities to pick up their services. Things like title searches, the ability to do a real estate transaction and know that when you're purchasing a house for those 1.5 million constituents, that you're buying a property that's free and clear of any title issues. They couldn't do any digital title searches for approximately a month. And so you think about how many real estate transactions that probably impacted, a lot of far-reaching impact from that attack. And then one of the very interesting stats to me is they wound up going to the controller and various financial officers physically signing every check that the county had to pay. And they wound up missing $140 million in vendor payments as a result because they had to slow down all their processes. And I never got an update actually on when they were able to get their automated processes back in place. But the thing to keep in mind is cybersecurity can disrupt all your normal business operations, and that's what you need to prepare for. So, promise that's the vast majority of the doom and gloom. I try not to focus on doom and gloom, and we'll focus more on how to improve and what to think about going forward. So I actually put this definition of cybersecurity. If you go look in a dictionary, this is what you get, something like this. And to me, it's actually not all that useful. And this is why people struggle with a lot of what's in cybersecurity is because it's hard to understand. We want to here simplify how we actually approach cybersecurity and think about it, so that you don't wind up in this just storm of words and all this marketing, buzzwords that is out on the internet and just leads to more confusion. Cybersecurity really boils down to three things: protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your systems and your data that you run in your environment. So when you hear cybersecurity, I want you to try and think about protecting those three categories: the constituent records, tax records, or whatever it is that you need to keep confidential in your organization. Or maybe you're a CMH and you have health records. Obviously, you need to keep those confidential. Making sure only the right people have access to the systems and data that they should. The integrity of those records. A very common attack these days, probably actually one of the leading financial impacts in cybersecurity is business email compromise, where they will email payroll or your accounts receivable or accounts payable departments to get vendor information changed. And so that then when you pay someone either their employee in their payment salary check, or you pay a vendor a significant payment, you wind up with invalid data in the actual vendor file or the employee data file, and you pay the wrong bank account. That's an example of an attack on integrity, and we want to try and protect those, oftentimes with good business processes. And then finally, what actually has shocked a lot of people into action is this third topic of availability. Ransomware fundamentally is an attack on availability of your systems. The attackers come in, they try and make it so none of your systems work, so that you'll pay them money and make them go away and have them unlock your systems. So as you're thinking about cybersecurity, you ever hear that term, or information security, you'll see I use those somewhat interchangeably here. I want you to think about these three buckets as what you're trying to protect and do something about. Let's take that to the next step. So so we're trying to protect these things. What are the goals of what our cybersecurity or information security program should be doing? We should be focusing on three things. We have to recognize that there's numerous attackers out there, and it's not realistic that we're going to be able to stop them all. So when you hear someone say, it's not a question of if you will be hit with something, it's a question of when, that's not a scare tactic. That's just saying, hey, if we don't apply this concept of trying to protect ourselves from what is very likely to occur, we won't be prepared when it does. And so our goals are going to be, though, to reduce how often those attacks actually do happen. So we want to reduce that attack frequency. We want to minimize the impact when an attack does come in. Sure, that phishing email made it through to your controller, but your security awareness training program made sure that controller understood that, hey, this is a suspicious email. Let's flag it, get over to the information security team. That attack still happened, but we minimized the impact. And then when things do go drastically wrong, we want to increase the resiliency of your organization, make it so that you can keep delivering your services, whatever those critical services are, in the event that something has gone drastically wrong and all of your IT systems are offline. We'll talk about how we achieve those goals through the rest of the presentation here. A couple types of attacks here to just throw these out there. Again, I'm not going to go into super far detail on all these. Ransomware, I've talked about this. What they're going to do is they're going to try and get into your environment and encrypt using mathematical algorithms They'll change the contents of the data on your computers or your servers and make it so that you can't actually open your files or run the applications, because those are just files under the hood. There's social engineering. It's a way that they'll get in. Maybe they'll actually use that social engineering to actually achieve their attack, but usually it's an entry point to go do something more. They want to get your users' login credentials, usernames, passwords. They want to be able to impersonate your users or get your users to do something they shouldn't. Like, I'm sure everyone's getting all sorts of text messages these days about your UPS packages or something like that. They want you to click on that link and either go steal your credentials or be able to do something on your behalf and in some way impact you in a negative way. That's an example of social engineering. Other common types of attacks: DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service. This is where attackers will use thousands or even millions of different devices across the internet that they've been able to compromise and use that to target somebody and make it so their systems just flat out don't work. And then business email compromise. I talked about that example already, where they'll try and get into an email account and then impersonate that person to get actions done that benefit them in some way. So here we are. I think we're on our first CP prompt. Aaron, I know you and I have had the unfortunate chance to work together on some business email compromise. I was curious on, from your perspective as your CFO in some of these organizations, what did you see? What jumped out to you? You're on mute, Aaron. Sorry about that. So.
I think the first thing, Paul, is that when we get an email in as a fraudulent change for banking information for an employee or a vendor, I don't naturally think of that as being a cyber attack. So that was something you kind of helped me educate. Like, that does fall under that umbrella. Even if the email that it's coming from wasn't compromised, right? If it's a compromised employee email, that's one thing. But even if they're just impersonating it, that still falls under that cyber attack umbrella. This is a wide array of things.
That's a great point. And to layer on top of that, I see many organizations respond to that initial email and just not do the change that was requested. But did they actually follow on to that and say, okay, is this a sign that one of our employees or one of our third-party relationships employees, that their accounts are compromised, and then act on that? And I've seen organizations really drop the ball there because they just remediated that first step. They took care of the first step. They didn't say, what does this actually mean behind the scenes? And that's what a good cybersecurity program will do, is make sure you're taken to that next step. So
I think another thing, Paul, is sometimes they'll say, oh, this was immaterial, right? Like, this was a small dollar amount, an isolated incident, and not be like, I don't have to inform my insurance carrier. I don't have to take, like you said, further action on this because it was a small issue and we stopped it and the cash flow didn't happen. And so knowing that there's more steps that should be taken other than just protecting our bank accounts.
Exactly. So I don't know. Hopefully the CP prompt, I think, is done. So we'll keep moving. We've got a lot of content for an hour here. So thanks for your input, Aaron. I'm sure we'll come back to you here in a little bit. So, all right. So I have a picture of the dam on this slide. And why do we start with a picture of a dam? And hopefully this is an analogy that helps when we're thinking about how to actually move forward with implementing the right cybersecurity processes in your organization. We want to think about it from a large kind of holistic project perspective of what we're trying to accomplish and build the right strategy to get there instead of just putting tools in place. A lot of organizations I talk to have started, they purchased some tool, put it in place, and expected that to cover all their needs. But they haven't done that first step of saying, what do we actually need to protect? Where are our confidentiality, integrity, and availability impacts on our organization? And so, similar to when you build a dam, you need to build a plan or a strategy for how you're going to actually hold back this massive amount of water, or in the case of cybersecurity, all this risk to your organization. We want the purpose of cybersecurity is similar to a dam in this case, where we want to protect and control the information systems and data that your organization relies on by building a robust defense layer. We can't just slap individual pylons in the water and expect that's going to stop all this water flow. We have to achieve this project. We're going to get across the entire riverfront in order to make sure that we actually have controlled that water flow correctly. Some statistics just to keep in mind. One thing I will throw out there, The Poneman Institute, I have a lot of respect for them as a survey. Their numbers do probably tend to be average on the high side based on how their metrics do get gathered. But there's still a lot of good data in the Poneman Institute study where they work with IBM Security on their annual cost of a data breach report. In their latest report, they found the average total cost of a data breach or cybersecurity incident was well north or close to $4.5 million. And the ransomware attacks in particular are trending above that amount. Here in the US, our highest costs are, US is the country with the highest costs. One thing though that I think would be really important to focus in on is they found the time to identify and contain the incident was on average 277 days. That number gets thrown around a lot, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but just keep that in mind. A lot of these attacks tend to trigger over a very long period of time. Some of them might execute within 24, 48 hours, but some execute over a year or more, like the Suffolk County example that we talked about. What's the root cause? I'll start with the one that everyone tends to think about, the malicious or criminal actor, the attack on your systems. And that's approximately 52%. So that is the majority of attacks. But it's important to know that the other half, close to half, is not a direct root cause from someone actively trying to break your environment. That attacker has found something, whether it's a misconfiguration or a glitch in one of your systems or a human error, and capitalized on that. And so the attacker is not actually the root cause. It was a human error or a system error before that that allowed the attacker to do something successfully. The other thing to keep in mind, especially for what I believe is a large amount of the group in attendance here, is that as smaller or medium-sized organizations, we oftentimes have a disadvantage in trying to protect ourselves. Because those costs to actually implement those security tools don't scale in our favor. Those tools are expensive oftentimes, and it takes a lot of work to do, and we have less resources to do those things. So proportionally to the size of our organization, we're at a disadvantage compared to large organizations. So don't necessarily think, hey, we're a small organization, we're less on the radar. That may be true, but the impact on your organization can be just as severe. We're actually already at our next CV prompt before we start diving into the 5 steps. Hopefully you remember the previous slide and can pick the right category. I know, Aaron, the example we talked about was the human error piece of, oftentimes that business email compromise starts with a human error of, hey, I clicked on that link, maybe I provided the credentials, or I used the weak password in the first place.
Yeah.
Have you seen any challenges in some of the organizations you serve that make it a little bit more difficult, or maybe not ones you're currently serving, that made it a little bit more difficult to get buy-in for some of these things?
Yeah, I think people don't think about like that human error piece, that can be very controlled, and that's where you have the biggest impact to be able to reduce your risk. Humans can cause errors, but they can also be one of your biggest strengths when you properly train your employees. And I know a lot of employees don't like security training, and not all our organizations do them routinely. I have the opportunity to do them routinely for multiple organizations. And, even well-trained professionals have, I think, like a 5% error rate, or that's kind of what I see.
Yeah, you're spot on. KnowBe4 does a study on that each year, and they put out metrics related to what they see. KnowBe4 is one of the leading cybersecurity training companies, if you're not aware of them. And you're spot on that on average, a well-trained organization is probably in the 3 to 5% range for click rates. And so we have to accept and build our process to account for the fact that humans are going to make mistakes.
But if we're able to get them down to that 5%, we can definitely at least reduce that slice of the pie.
Make it a lot fewer attacks, reduce the frequency of the attacks, as we said earlier. So, all right, so let's think about the process you should be approaching for your organization. First and foremost, as I said in the dam analogy, we need to build the strategy. And to build the strategy, a huge part of that is making sure we have the right people at the table, as we'll talk about in a second. The other thing I want everyone to think about, cybersecurity feels technical. There's lots of technical buzzwords or technical tools we use to solve problems. But under the hood, cybersecurity fundamentally for every organization is this concept of risk management. We need to know what our risks are, and we need to be able to then adjust our approach based on what the risks are to our organization. If we don't know what our risks are, what the impacts are on our organization, then we can't make sure we're putting the right controls in place. So we want to think about, as you're going through cybersecurity and building a strategy, we're just going to start with something that looks at what our risks are. We'll talk about that in a minute. The risk management process fundamentally is knowing what those threats are and the vulnerabilities they can act on in our environment, and then the likelihood that something will actually do that. And when it does, what's going to happen to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad that I talked about earlier. And the reason we need to gather that information is so that we can make a decision proactively about where we're going to spend our time and budget. And this basically is a scale here. We can spend time and money up front, or we can spend time and money after something goes wrong. And so it may actually make the right sense in some situations to, on certain decisions, to spend that time and money afterwards, because it's actually going to cost less or have less of an impact on our ability to deliver our services, to do it reactively and clean it up afterwards instead of do it proactively. Majority of situations, that's probably not true. But if you have that right data input into your process, you can make those decisions in an informed manner. I think it's important for people to understand, what it looks like on an impact perspective. So I put an example ransomware timeline. This is from something that I personally observed and aligns with some of the security data I've seen out there. When you get hit with ransomware for a not very well prepared organization, it can take a very long time to get back to normal. On average, about 21 days. But I would actually tell you it's probably a lot of organizations that respond and clean it up within 2 to 5 days, and then a lot of organizations that respond and clean it up within 3 to 5 weeks or more. The organization I'm thinking about that I built this timeline on, they were probably back to 90% effectiveness, normal operations within 35 days or so. But then they're still, I actually have emails from them today from an incident in March where they're still cleaning up and dealing with some of the insurance costs and things like that. So it's important to know that the impacts of something going wrong take a very long time to play out. Another thing as we think about building the leadership team and get management buy-in is to understand some of the underlying motivations that make cybersecurity hard, because cybersecurity is genuinely hard for a lot of organizations, and that's real, that's realistic. So I don't want people to just feel like, hey, we're not doing things perfectly. We need to understand that there's underlying drivers that make it that it's hard to do. So if a management team decides to invest in, improving their resiliency, reducing impact and frequency of incidents, then they're really prioritizing a long-term return that might not make them look good in their day jobs for the short term. And that's understood. So it's a long-term payback that's hard to measure. But if you choose to not do those things, then you have a much more short-term visible return or lack of investment in the first place that you might make some of your other metrics, especially financial metrics, look better. And so cybersecurity is a long-term investment that can make it hard to get support and justification for some of the investments that you need to make. So just keeping this in mind in terms of what those motivators are as you're approaching these conversations, so you can have these conversations with the best thing in mind. So who's on the information security team? Information security fundamentally has to be a collaborative process across the entirety of the organization. Your IT team, or if you're large enough to have a dedicated InfoSec team, yeah, they may be a key player in actually solving a lot of these issues, but fundamentally they need the involvement of the rest of the organization, because the risks sit with the rest of the organization. Excuse me one second. So there also are some controls and security protections that need to be put in place and acted on by each of those representatives throughout the rest of the organization. Like Erin talked about, she gets the pleasure of doing information security training for all sorts of a number of her clients. And that's an example of a control where she's participating as a part of the information security program. And so the risks need to be guided by the operational teams or other non-IT technical teams, and the controls on those controls need to be guided as well. So fundamentally, cybersecurity has to be collaborative. We want to pull in information security, IT, operations, financial departments, executive leadership teams, and make sure they all have a seat at the table. Whatever your governance function is, whether you have a board of commissioners or some other equivalent, or you just have an executive director and his or her leadership team. Whatever they are, we want that governance function to be involved, because it's been shown that when that governance function is involved, there's much better investment and outcomes in cybersecurity. We need those leadership teams from all the other departments in the organization at the table, because if they don't support their teams actually doing the things they should to be effective in cybersecurity, then you're not going to actually have an effective cybersecurity program without that buy-in from the rest of the leadership team. You need someone actually assigned that information security officer role, even if it's not just their sole job title as ISO. You want to make sure that someone's formally designated as taking responsibility for that, and that, speaking frankly, that you're getting the right person for that role, and you're making sure they're compensated accordingly. And then we need IT involved, because IT is often the team that's implementing a lot of these controls and security protections as well. So we've got the right team at the table. We're going to have conversations about how we approach our cybersecurity program. Where do you go next? Next, as I said, we want to make sure we identify what we're trying to protect. We're going to start off with some sort of form of risk assessment for our organization to build our strategy on. Fundamentally, I like to start with a business impact analysis, and this starts in the operational departments. What are those services that you need to be able to deliver on a day-to-day, week-to-week, or whatever frequency, in order for your organization to do things you need to be doing? What are the systems and data assets that those processes and functions need to be able to operate? And what types of data is collected as part of it? Are there regulatory risks on that data because it's personal health information or tax information or something like that? And so we need to know what the business is doing, or the operations or the rest of the organization is doing, and then protecting those processes based on how critical they are. Not every process needs the same level of protection, and so we want to build our processes accordingly. So we've identified out of the business impact analysis what we're trying to protect. What are those systems that we need to make sure are covered? And then for each of those, let's start gathering information about the level of security that they need and identifying those individual pieces. I won't go through this full list. That the materials will be out on this the website, and definitely happy to take any follow-up questions on it. So as we go into this next CPE prompt, really it's making sure, do we truly know what we're trying to protect in that identify phase? And those two slides simplified it far more than that effort actually looks like in the real world. But it's really important to have that integration with the rest of the organization.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts on this as we look at this question in the last couple of slides. One is that I've seen that the tone at the top is so important. You know, what you see leadership or the board, the directors doing flows down to their staff. And I've also seen, when you go through that risk analysis process, that it's possible to over-assess risk or place extreme emphasis on the risk to the point where controls are established that employees then are working around the controls to be able to do their jobs effectively, and thereby creating more risk to the organization.
You are spot on. And that's where, being responsive to the rest of the organization is extremely important. We need to make sure that we have the buy-in and we're implementing things that our teams will actually do. People, to a certain extent, people are going to go around some security controls. We need to monitor for that and figure out where those weaknesses are. And if your information security team is or whoever fills that role is separated from the rest of the business and not in touch with the actual processes the rest of the organization is doing, then there's a very real chance that you're going to implement the wrong types of controls to protect your organization. There's any given control. We'll talk about cybersecurity frameworks here in a minute. Any given control has many ways they can be implemented. And so we want to make sure we implement the right way for what your organization is trying to accomplish. That's a great point, Aaron. Glad you brought it up. So, all right, the prompt went past. I'm going to keep us moving here pretty quick. Running about a minute behind. I want to try and make sure people have a little bit of time at the end for questions. All right, so now we're going into this protect phase. We've identified what we need to protect. Now let's go build the protection, or identify the right protections for those, as you just talked about, Aaron, about what it is that we need to be, what our processes need to be able to accomplish, so that we're not approaching them the wrong way, putting too much or too little security in place. So you jumped the gun, and I'm glad you did, pretty much that top section there. And so I'll actually jump to the next one that talks about third-party control frameworks. And so a lot of people will just, they might do some of these and start designing controls, but they don't necessarily have a starting point of saying, what are those things across the board that we should be putting in place? And so a third-party control framework, there's a couple out there that are used frequently, can really help with that. It helps us overcome our internal assumptions and biases about the types of controls that are effective to say, all right, let's go across the board through dedicated thought process to say, here's what is recommended. How does that apply to our organization, and what should that look like internally? And that's something that should be refreshed on a periodic basis, at least annually. And so a couple of the common frameworks that I see most commonly used, especially in the public sector, are the NIST cybersecurity framework. We've built a lot of our internal programs on NIST CSF, and there's a new version actually that's in draft and about to be released. They'll put some good improvements in place. The other one that's commonly used, although it's for-profit, is, or you have to pay for it at least, in certain use cases, is the CIS, Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls. They put out a good control framework. There's other frameworks you might use, but these are good starting points that are very flexible and usable across the board. A key point of this, as you think about demonstrating your organization is doing the right thing, using a third-party framework and also, and beyond just genuinely being useful, can help you make sure that you show you've applied these concepts of due care and due diligence. As leaders in your organization or whatever your roles are, it's important that in your job, you're actually doing the due care, applying due care and due diligence. So you've determined what the right things are that you should be doing and applying them proactively. This concept of using these frameworks can really help with that. In this section, I'm actually keeping it pretty high level. In the actual build out, I go into more controls, but one thing that did come out of the 2022 Ponemon report, the average cost of a data breach, is what controls they found were actually effective. And hopefully you're looking at these for your organization. MFA, a lot of people in the cybersecurity space are continuing to harp on this concept of a multi-factor authentication. Just to make sure I'm on the same page, obviously you have your passwords, you have these apps or messages on your phone that you get that confirm you are who you actually say you are. So the system has more than one way to identify you. That's in place because passwords are inherently weak. Because they can be compromised, they can be captured. You have a data breach, one organization, they didn't apply the right security. That means that your password's now in the public. And if we haven't used a good password, that makes it so the threat actor can use that and log in as you. If you have multi-factor authentication in place, that's an additional separate thing from your password. That means that the system can verify you are who you actually say you are. A couple of things I call out here is the XDR tools. So this is extended detection and response, basically some sort of detection and response technical tools that goes above and beyond antivirus that people typically have had in the past. We'll talk about that later on as one of the controls. Board level oversight. I talked about governance function being really key. You can see that was the fourth. Sorry, I've got this backwards, but one of the top 10 most impactful things is if the board had this as a regular topic of conversation. And then having contingency plans, making sure you've got plans built out and you test them of how you respond when something starts to go wrong or you have an indicator that something's going wrong. So I'm going into the build phase here. So we've gone through this strategy process of identifying what we're trying to protect, having the right people at the table, identifying what we're trying to protect, building out the right security, identifying the right security controls for us to actually implement in that protect phase. And now we'll go build them. I've thrown some examples in here of common controls and things that are very useful to hopefully get some value out of this. And we'll just touch on these briefly. We mentioned cybersecurity training, extremely important. And one thing I'll call out is there was a study done in Germany of 30,000 people, so a pretty large study, and they found that cybersecurity best practices started to be applied less or not be applied after 4 months. And so it's important that we're doing that frequent and probably shorter cybersecurity training in order to make sure that people keep applying those practices. We don't want to do just once a year training anymore. It needs to be more often than that. And excuse me, something like KnowBe4 or an equivalent tool is a great way to do that in short 5 to 10 minute chunks once a month. I talk about passwords being weak. Another thing is we got to change the way we think about the passwords where we do need to use them. And so we've trained people to use option A. I'll shortcut this and give you a cheat for you. We've trained people to use option A and actually avoid something like option B where we're using real words in our passwords. But the reality is that when you do the math of how the system works under the hood, it's actually, we've made it harder for people by using things like option A than something like option B. People that are good at remembering words, they're not good at remembering these random strings of characters, numbers, and special symbols. So we need to go to processes that are actually easier for people and harder for computers. And that's this concept of what's called the passphrase. You can see that in that first example, option A, with modern technology, it would take a computer about 8 hours, an advanced computer dedicated to this task, about 8 hours to crack that password. That second one, what looks probably less secure, would actually take in the many millions, billions, septillions of years to actually, for modern computers to break until quantum computing comes along. We'll deal with that when it gets there. So use your passphrases instead of a password. If your organization's not already doing this across the board, you usually can still use something like this. Maybe you can't use spaces, but you can still use this concept. And this is what good security looks like. Go for that length and make it memorable to people by using words. And happy to give more guidance on that of what a good passphrase process looks like. The other concept is password vaults. They've been in the news lately for some things, some companies getting hit. However, they're actually genuinely still more secure and a better option than people using the same password on every site that they're doing, because that's the reality, is that when we make people have a password for every site that they have to remember, they're going to use something that's very similar on each site so they can remember what it is. And so password vault is a tool that you can have on your computer that you have one passphrase you remember to open the vault, and then you use that to actually access and store all your passwords so you don't have to remember them. Makes it much easier to actually apply security in your environment. One thing I often see go wrong at clients, executives ask for exemptions on their security controls. They need their processes work smoothly. Maybe they don't get access to as many systems, things like that. However, executives are generally going to be the individuals that are going to be targeted first at an organization for many reasons. There's publicly information available, and there's a much higher return on the attacker's time if they're able to compromise that executive's account, because other people will do what that executive asks, usually with asking a lot less questions. So an example here at Rehmann, our CEO, someone impersonated the CEO and sent a text message out to a huge portion of the organization saying, hey, this is a CEO of your organization, so-and-so, can you please go call me, give me a call to help me with something. Our information security team got reports on it and jumped on it, but it shows that example of your executives are going to be targeted, and so you need to protect them more, not less. So we should actually apply more security to our executives, not give them exemptions from our security controls. Backups, it's important to back up your data, have it in multiple places, and that's not like 2 places in your building. Have it offsite somewhere. There's many ways to achieve that. But we want to make sure that if something goes wrong, we have recent data that we can use to bring our systems back, and that's aligned with what your business needs for many metrics. We want to break up our environment, this concept of network segmentation. So it's a fairly technical concept, but basically we have these connections between all of our computers. If the computers don't need to be able to talk to each other, they shouldn't be able to. And so we want to break up our networks so that there's more barriers, so that if an attacker gets on my computer or Aaron's computer, they can't hit the whole environment. They can only hit a small chunk of it. We want good firewalls. That's our external protection of internet traffic. And then we want something that's in this intrusion detection or prevention process that looks at network traffic and says, hey, here's something that looks suspicious. Let's stop it and have someone confirm if it's legitimate before we allow it to happen. Along that same concept is 2 of the tools on here called a SIEM, a Security Information Event Management tool, or an EDR. I'm throwing these terms out, by the way, not so that you memorize them or something like that, but when you get pulled into that leadership conversation, because I've said that many of you probably need to be in it, you have some basis for what these are. Don't need to memorize them, but hopefully you're at least familiar with them. So there's this whole suite of tools that many organizations haven't had historically that gather all these logs and the data from all the systems that are in your environment, and then analyze that automatically to say, hey, it's weird that Aaron's logging in from Vietnam. So why is that the case? And throws an alert. Maybe Aaron, you actually went on vacation in Vietnam, or maybe there's actually someone in Vietnam or connecting through Vietnam that's impersonating you, and that's a sign that your account's been compromised. So tools like this look at that type of data and analyze it automatically and stop that activity to say, hey, put a hold on it until we can validate that it's okay and it's something legitimate before we allow it to continue, so that we stop those attackers before they get away with some more significant attacks. Okay. let's see here. Our next CPE prompt is, how are you feeling about the topics we've gone over so far today? Hopefully I haven't scared you off a whole bunch. What I want you all to get out of this is something that you have to apply a process to, and make sure you input the time as a leadership team at your organization to secure yourself the right way. And you can't just hand it off to IT and say, hey, go fix it. You got to do more than that. It involves the rest of the organization. It involves CFOs like Aaron, in that process. So Aaron, I'm curious if anything stood out to you in the last chunk of content as we went through
Yeah,
it.
I was going to say, it's highlighted that you can't just tell IT like it's your job to protect everything and expect them to do it in isolation. And it's not to your benefit to do that either, right? Because the operational people need to understand how the controls work and how it's going to impact their day to day so that you can make the best selection for the operation of the organization. I think one of the other things that jumped out to me, when you were looking at the items on your chart about what could reduce the cost or the impact, some of those things are very easy and minimal from a budget perspective, board involvement, employee training. They're not going to cost you a lot. It doesn't take a ton of time, but it can have a huge impact on the overall cost of an attack if it happens.
Yeah,
Or when
and
it happens, right? Because it's not if, but when at this point.
in my effort to get us caught up, I went through that last section a little faster than I planned, so we actually have time. I'm going to go back and use one of the examples I skimmed to pick on this a little bit more along the concept of what you were talking about in terms of the rest of the organization needing to give guidance to the IT team. So this concept of data backups, that's a very technical control. It's saying under the hood, hey, we have this system, our ERP system, our general ledger system, wherever that sits, that we do all of our financial processing through. We expect our IT team to back it up, and they probably do. But how do we know they back it up often enough, or that they'll be able to bring it back online soon enough if something goes wrong? And so that's an answer that has to come from the teams that rely on it. And so, Aaron, an example of how you get that, Aaron, you and I would go have a conversation for whatever your financial reporting systems are at so-and-so client. We say, all right, Aaron, 3 main metrics I want to gather from you. Your recovery point objective. This is a concept of how much data you can afford to lose when something goes wrong. Because if you're restoring from backup, it's almost guaranteed that there's some amount of time that we've lost anything that was done in the system over that period of time. And if you don't have a way to recreate those transactions, then you need a much shorter recovery metric there of your recovery point objective. And so many IT teams are backing up once a day. But what if you can only afford to lose the last 2 hours of transactions, and you discover that when you go to restore a backup, and you realize, hey, there was critical data that we can't recreate or recover, and it was so we needed a much shorter metric for recovery time. And so recovery point objective is one thing that is a great input from the business. And the outcome of that is a technical control, making sure we have the right backup system, it's happening often enough, and we have the ability to recover enough. But the input, the guidance, how frequently that needs to happen really came from the rest of the organization. Other metrics in that space are your recovery time objective and your maximum allowable downtime that relate to each other. Your RTO says, hey, our backup process, we store it in the cloud, we're gonna have to download it and then spin it back up in our internal computers or whatever that process looks like for your organization. And that's going to take 8 hours to do. But what if you need access to it within 2? Or what it's going to take a week to do it because you have to have someone inspect the backups to make sure they're okay before we bring them back online. If you have a system that you can't go more than a day or half a day without, and your recovery process is going to take longer than that, we need to know that so we can adjust what our recovery process is. We might need to make more investment or something on those lines, or we might need to put other processes in place to make sure we can go for a longer period of time in our operational processes, and because we don't have the budget or capacity to invest more in a technical solution. So recovery time objective is your target for how quickly you need the system back online. And then beyond that is saying, all right, we're past our objective, our target for how quickly will be restored. What is when do we really start to be impacted and have some sort of pain within the organization that we cannot accept picking on payroll. Maybe you do biweekly payroll. You want your payroll system back online within a day or two, so you record your timesheets. But if we've gone 2 weeks, we've probably missed our payroll cycle, and now we have a whole bunch of employees that haven't been paid. And so that's an example of, we have our target recovery time, and then we have a longer maximum time that we can't go more than that time frame before a system is brought back. So hopefully that's a good example of showing where that collaboration between the technical teams and the organization needs to occur. So. Another one I'll spend a bit more time on is this concept of these two tools here, the security information and event management tool, and then the endpoint detection response tools. When your teams go out to look for these things, you're going to see all sorts of marketing buzzwords about them when you try and find the right one for them. You need to know that this is a big process to make sure you have the right tools that are going to work for your environment. Everyone's using the similar marketing terms for what they cover, but their actual technical capabilities of what they can monitor and secure for you are oftentimes vastly different. And so you need to understand, hey, what do we need to protect? What are these data feeds that we can monitor to make sure we can detect an attacker and stop them before they actually do something malicious? And then and make sure that organization and their tool can actually do those things before, so you don't want to implementing something that only covers part of your environment. So these are critical tools. People historically have had things like antivirus, there's all sorts of antivirus tools out there that looked for files and things like that and said, hey, this file is malware, we need to block it. These tools go beyond that and say, here's something that is suspicious based on the activity. I used that example earlier of Aaron connecting from Vietnam, but maybe it's just something like, why is this user running this this person that only operates our payroll process isn't a technical user at all? Why are they in there changing things in the way the computer works? That's odd for them to do that, and it might be a sign that an attacker has compromised that person's account and it is on their computer. And so that's an example of the type of activity that the system alerts, because a lot of attackers these days no longer use malware as a starting point, or they might use a malware that's not detected. And so we want to look at the activity to say, is the activity of the users on the computers normal? We can't do that with people looking at all these logs. We need these automated tools and analysis tools, analysis processes that will say, look at what's normal for any user or computer on the environment and then act based on that. Yeah, so that's some great examples. I was just checking to see if there's any questions that come up to respond to here. Okay, we'll keep us moving forward. Cyber insurance. This is an incredibly important concept. I imagine the vast majority of organizations on the call here have cyber insurance, but you got to make sure you're approaching your cybersecurity insurance the right way. Cyber insurance is one of the only ways you can truly transfer risk. And that's this concept that, if you engage an external IT company, or especially an external security company, you're bringing in experts to help control your environment and make sure you're doing the right things. But they cannot guarantee that your environment's going to be secure. And at the end of the day, the impact, if they miss something, is on your organization. And so your organization, even if you hire these experts to come in and secure your environment, is still the one at risk. And we can't remove that risk except essentially through buying insurance, that they'll pay for our losses or what the impact is when something goes wrong. Insurance carriers have taken huge hits on their profits and things like that over the last 5 years or so as ransomware really started to explode. And so as a result, they're putting all sorts of stipulations and controls in place on their end that make it harder for you to get insurance and make it additional requirements, things like that. And so it's important for you to know what you're doing when you're getting cyber insurance, because oftentimes it's someone like Aaron as a CFO that's actually going through that process of the cyber insurance application, et cetera. You might pull in an IT person, but if you go into that blindly and don't make sure you've got the right resources at hand to address these things, then you could wind up putting your whole policy at risk and not getting any coverage at all. So we want to obtain our policy. So when we obtain that policy, they're probably going to make you fill out some sort of attestation form that says, for example, Beasley's someone that I frequently run into that provides a lot of organization cybersecurity insurance. I think their form is like 5 to 7 pages now of detailed questions about exact technical things in your environment. And that if you answer, oftentimes they're worded vaguely, so that it's hard to figure out, okay, how does this question apply in our environment? How should we answer this? Are we answering it correctly? Because if we're not, and we submit that attestation form to the insurance broker and then the carrier, and they provide you a policy, they actually bind your policy based on that attestation form, you have a loss event, you file a claim, they come in and say, hey, your attestation form said you're doing XYZ, and we see that you didn't. And so now they've gone ahead and they'll probably rescind your policy, say, hey, we'll refund your premiums. That's what you get out of this. You'll get that couple grand or however much your premiums are for your organization. But that $700,000 or $1 million of actual losses might not be covered. Unfortunately, I think we've seen examples of that in the public sector in the last couple of months, where either coverage wasn't enough, or there was the policy itself was not in effect and you weren't able to rely on it. So in addition to that, so there's a whole process of getting the insurance in the first place. That takes time. So if you're someone that hasn't gone through this recently, make sure you start that renewal process significantly in advance. Those requirements from your insurance companies are changing every year. They're putting more and more strict requirements in place. The actual, what they're willing to cover as part of the policy, and the caveats and carve-outs are increasing, so that they'll pay for less on certain things, or they might say, hey, this was an act of war, therefore it doesn't count. So just know that it's a whole process to go through to get your cybersecurity insurance. And it's not something as simple as just paying them a check and having it in place. The other side of it is oftentimes there's ongoing maintenance requirements, things you have to do in your environment. Aaron, you and I talked, and then one of the examples you brought up earlier, notifying your insurance carrier. When you have that business email compromise with payroll, yeah, you stopped the financial loss. There was nothing that you would actually file a claim for, but you've had a cybersecurity incident where potentially one of your users' accounts was compromised. Is that something you need to report to your insurer? Might be, might not be, depends on your policy, and you need to know that. And so you need to know what you need to do in order to keep your policy in effect through the length of the whole term of the policy. And so an example of that is notifying your carrier when you have a potential incident, even if it's not something you plan to file a claim for, because if then there's a claim that winds up down the road and they find out there was something that led to it earlier on that you didn't notify them about, then your whole policy might be, again, your claim might be denied because you didn't actually notify them timely according to when the incident started.
Yeah, I think we've seen that with organizations that I've worked with, that there's typically a filing window and you usually aren't able to finish your investigation on the scope of it before that window would pass. So it's critical that you have that communication with your carrier and open a claim, even if you don't expect to have them pay anything.
Yeah, and it may or may not be opening a claim. It may just literally be notification of, hey, we've had this, and they may choose to say, yeah, that's something worth opening a claim for or not. They may say, hey, it doesn't sound like you have enough context to really know if your environment's clean. Let's go activate a claim. Let's bring in the experts that I've listed on this next slide here to actually help you respond and investigate. And so oftentimes when you do have an incident, there's services you'll get access to through your insurance carrier, 3 main ones. The first is a cybersecurity focused legal team. And incidents that I've helped with, they're the ones that take the point, makes it so everything is covered under attorney-client privilege. And then they can provide legal guidance because there's legal implications of how you respond to the incident. The next is a very technical team that specializes in going into your environment and looking for what's called indicators of compromise. How did that attacker get in? Figuring out how that attacker got in. What have they actually done? What did they have access to? Was there, if you're a regulated organization, CMHs in particular, I'm thinking of, did they get access to PHI, personal health information, as an example? Or maybe you're a school district. Did they get access to student data and therefore you have a FERPA violation? Things like that. And so you need to know the extent of where the attackers got and have done enough there. And a DFIR, or digital forensics and investigate incident response team, specializes in those things. Your internal cybersecurity team, they might have a starting point, but they're not really specialized in that level of investigation. So it's important to pull in an organization that does it. Finally, say it's a ransomware event. They'll probably pull in a negotiation expert as well. Even if you don't intend to pay the ransomer, I mean, you don't want to give money to criminals if you don't have to. You might not have a choice at the end of the day, but those negotiation experts will keep that attacker kind of on the hook. So that incident I talked about back in March, that organization chose to continue talking to the attackers even though they had no intent to ever pay them, because of the fact that that if the attacker thought they wouldn't, they would immediately start responding by publishing all that data they'd stolen and potentially following up with another attack, or calling and harassing, or finding ways to impact the employees of the organization. And so those threat actors will do whatever they can if they think you're not going to pay them, to make your life miserable. And so those negotiation experts can help make sure you're prepared and reduce the chance of that happening in the first place. Let's see here. All right, we're short on time. I'm gonna keep moving quickly. So keep swinging back and forth, short or long in time. In assessing cybersecurity, we need to monitor our controls once we have them in place to make sure they're working the way we intend. So in addition to actually, putting the controls in place, bring someone in to actually assess the security of your environment and make sure your controls are actually working the way you intend and planned. So whether that's an annual, audit of some sort or some other approach to that, we want to make sure that someone's coming in and looking at your environment independently and saying, yeah, you're in a good spot. You also want to do internal tabletops of the contingency plans. We want to build processes to make sure that we're covered. We want to do technical tests of the environment and make sure that we've validated we don't have flaws in the way our technical environment's implemented. System glitches and similar things. Back on the root cause analysis, very large portion of what was the root cause of an incident. And so this helps detect and help you figure out how to stop that. We want to make sure we're doing training and then testing the effectiveness of that training to see how often our users actually click. Okay, CP prompt number 5. Hopefully this is feeling like you're going in the right direction and getting the information you need to be more effective internally. I won't judge you no matter what your answer is here, but hopefully you're feeling like you're able to go in the right direction out of this and feel like you've got the right starting steps. All right, I'm going to keep us going. The last section, just to let everyone out on time, is really focused on policies and procedures. What we want to make sure we do out of the policies and procedures section here is we've made all these decisions, made all these designs for our environment. We want to make sure we actually apply them and know what our decisions were. If we don't actually document that stuff in policy and procedure, then we won't actually have something to reference to, and when we have to revisit that in the future. Or when you want to refresh your approach, you want to review those policies and procedures to make sure that they continue to be the right controls for your environment based on changes that have happened or just updates in the context of the cybersecurity world. And so that's usually captured in something like an information security program, comprehensive document that captures a lot of those control decisions. You want to have something like an employee acceptable use policy that tells your people how to actually use computers, things like that. You want to monitor your third parties, vendors, suppliers, things like that. And then you want to build contingency plans. 3 key ones: business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, and incident response plan. Very critical to improving the resilience of your organization. That's at noon, and we're at the end of our content. So hopefully you got value out of this. Please feel free to follow up with questions. Anything else for us to wrap up? All right.
Thank you, Paul. This concludes today's program. Thank you all for joining us. With respect to people's time, we will be reaching out directly to answer any questions submitted that were not able to be answered during the webinar. If you would like to learn more, please visit Rehmann's website at www.rehmann.com. You can also email us at publicsector@rehmann.com. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all. Thanks, Aaron.